So the way a lot of people get ethics and morality wrong today is, hey, they like the cooperative side. And the cooperative side is good. It's essential, and you have to have it. But there will also always be the competitive side too, and it's every bit as essential to the whole. Howdy, Dr. Reed here at The Political Animal, and today we're going to talk about the cardinal virtues and why you need them. So, the first thing we should do is make sure we know what the cardinal virtues are. And the list of the cardinal virtues, according to the classical tradition, includes temperance, courage, justice, and practical wisdom. These are the virtues thought to be paramount or foundational in the classical tradition. Now, when I say classical tradition, I'm talking about Greek philosophy. Think of guys like Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. Most of what you'll hear from me is going to be from a broadly Aristotelian perspective. Now, as soon as we start talking about the virtues, there are going to be some people who dismiss it outright. Some people think it's just a waste of time. And by people, I really mean people in the academy. I mean professors of the humanities, and even some moral philosophers. There's really two forms that this rejection of the virtues takes. We'll call one a mild form and the other a severe form. The mild form takes the position that the cardinal virtues, or virtue ethics, express values from a culture, well, that's in the past, a foreign culture. These values are completely historically conditioned. We can't recover that past. And so they really have no modern relevance. And so, as these people see it, the modern world has different values. And really, it's a waste of time to be thinking about Greek virtues. And I think the way they look at it, it's kind of like someone geeking out over Star Wars or collecting Lord of the Rings memorabilia. So these virtue ethics people, they're just geeking out on Greek culture. And maybe it's harmless in and of itself, but it's just not that relevant. And at best, it's nostalgia for a bygone era. That's the mild dismissal of the virtues. The severe dismissal of the virtues comes from the idea that one, they don't have any moral seriousness, and two, really, they're an opportunity for something like narcissistic self-absorption. They make a vice out of moral purity. So rather than focusing on the weightier matters of the law, people who are interested in the virtues are focused entirely on themselves. So in the minds of these critics, it's like thinking about the virtues defeats the point of morality. The whole point of morality, they think, is to be thinking about other people. And with the virtues, you're just thinking about yourself. And so it's like positively harmful for morality. And I have to say, these are both common takes, very common takes, especially in the academy, among even people who do moral philosophy, certainly among people who do theology and other humanities. They're also really bad takes. Really, they just kind of show significant, let's call it unfamiliarity with the virtues. And I think once you start studying them, these are not really tenable positions. Now, we can forgive these critics who dismiss the virtues because they think of the virtues as tied to something called morality. Or maybe a better way to put it right now is tied to a modern conception of morality. The modern conception of morality is of this external standard. It doesn't really have anything to do with you or your flourishing. And really, it's just kind of something you have to conform to, right? It's a bunch of rules you have to follow. And so, what it means to be moral is to continuously tailor and trim and conform your behavior to match up to this external standard. Now, if that's your vision of morality, then morality is pretty boring. Clearly, the virtues would be even more boring, right? Because what is there for virtues to be other than habits of obedience? That's really boring, and nobody wants to talk about that. And so you can see how they could get this idea that virtues are a kind of moral fetish, kind of obsessing over moral purity, which is really just following rules. If that's your conception of morality, first, I'm sorry. It's a terrible conception of morality, even though it's a very common conception. It's the dominant one today. It's even very common in academic philosophy, but it's wrong, and we'll talk about that. But let me tell you right now, Plato and Aristotle do not have that conception of the virtues at all. They don't even have that concept of morality. They're not trying to conform themselves to some rule. They're not trying to be better rule followers. The central concept for Plato and Aristotle, and I don't know why I keep saying them together. Um, I'm an Aristotelian, so I'm just going to say Aristotle from now on. Aristotle is interested in this notion of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, or human well-being. Aristotle is not asking, how can I become a better rule follower? Aristotle is asking, how can I live the best life possible? What is the good life? What does the best life look like? What kind of person do I need to become? And it's this inquiry into the good life, the best life, that's what leads Aristotle to the virtues. And so these virtues, and again, I'll remind you, temperance, courage, justice, practical wisdom, these virtues are seen by Aristotle as essential to the best kind of life, the happiest kind of life. And so if you're new to this, you're probably wondering, well, how can virtues be necessary for happiness? Well, let's go through them in order. But first, we need to talk about what precisely makes for a good and happy life. So, why would virtues be essential to living a happy life or living a good life? So, here we need to investigate how Aristotle views happiness. And the key will be to see that Aristotle thinks happiness is active. And in fact, it's not only active, it's composed of various other activities and projects. And this is going to lead to a pretty significant contrast between the classical conception of eudaimonia and the modern conception of happiness. So we're going to see a really big difference between the way Aristotle thinks of happiness and the way we today at least talk about happiness. And I'm not actually sure that we really disagree with Aristotle when we start to really dig down, but at least the way we talk about happiness is very different. We tend to talk about happiness as a feeling, or a collection of feelings, or a series of feelings over time, and we tend to associate it with pleasure. So generally, we talk about it as something that, well, happens to you, something passive. Aristotle views it very differently. He views happiness, or eudaimonia, as an activity. It's something you do. Happiness is something you do. Now, don't worry. Aristotle thinks pleasure is an important part of it, but you guys aren't ready for Aristotle's view of pleasure. Not yet. So for now, let's just say happiness is an activity. One of the most common ways of interpreting Aristotle here is that happiness is an activity, but it's an activity that is composed of other activities. It is an activity that is inclusive of the best activities. So what are these activities like? Well, think of activities like practices, projects, and particular commitments to particular people. Let's start there. So think of practices like the practice of music. Things like playing the violin or playing the trumpet in an ensemble. Music's a great example of a practice. Uh, but we could just as easily talk about the practice of medicine or the practice of law. And we could also talk about fulfilling certain social roles. Think about the activities associated with being a good husband or a good father or even a good citizen. Aristotle thinks happiness, or eudaimonia, is composed of these kinds of activities. And when we start looking at these activities, we see that they actually have certain things in common. They are internal goods, standards of excellence, they require self-cultivation, we share them with others, and they have to be sustained over time. So first, let's talk about internal goods. Here's the idea. Think about a professional tennis player and think about a professional violin player, okay? So they both get paid for what they do. They both get money and they both get recognized. So let's say they both get fame and status and they both get money. But that's not all they get. If all they got was just money or money and fame, then they'd be getting the exact same kind of thing. But if you've ever played sports or music, then you understand there's a certain kind of good that you participate in that's entirely internal to the activity itself. And so the goodness of playing tennis and the goodness of playing music, they're two separate things. Even if the external payoffs are the same, There's a certain kind of good unique to each activity. There's a certain kind of good unique to tennis. And that's why a lot of people, most people, the vast majority of us, we play music and sports not for the benefit of money, not for any external good, but for the internal goods of the activity itself. And closely related to this is that these practices have standards of excellence. You can do them well or poorly. You can improve your ability to play tennis. You can improve your ability to play the trumpet. You can be a better husband or a worse husband. You can be a good citizen. You can be a bad citizen. And so once we start thinking about these practices as having standards of excellence that are tied to the internal goods, then we realize that they require self-cultivation to do them well. And what that means is these practices actualize some potential within you. If you're someone with musical talent, when you first start playing, you have a lot of potential. And then after years and years of playing, that potential is actualized. You manifest that potential in the playing of music. And in the process of becoming better at your practice or your activity or your craft, it actually changes you. You start off, all of us, we all start off indeterminate with a lot of potential for different things. And then over time, based on the activities we pursue, we cultivate ourselves to be a particular kind of person. That is, these practices, these activities, they leave an imprint on your character. So as you shape yourself to become good at them, they're shaping who you are. From there, if you think about any complex and worthwhile activity with standards of excellence, you'll note that it's an activity shared with others. This is obvious with sports and music when we're playing on a team or playing on an ensemble, but it applies even to individual events and even to solo practice. So the only reason that you can play the violin, you, is because you're part of an extended tradition of music where the violin was practiced. If you had to invent the violin and you had to invent musical notation yourself, then you probably would not have advanced the practice very far. Not by yourself, like living in a cave. So you had to learn the violin from someone else. Now, in the case of social roles like being a judge or a professor or a mother, the shared with others aspect, it's front and center. Most of what we do that is worthwhile is embedded in a shared social context with others. The final thing we notice about these activities is that these activities are sustained over time. If we're talking about music and sports, which are the best examples, the most familiar examples we have, it's not like you play a song on the piano one day and you're like, all right, I'm done with the piano. I've completed my piano playing. It's not like that. What makes it a practice is that you're never really done, not unless you lose your appreciation for music. As long as you love music, as long as your love for music remains, your piano playing or your practice of the piano is continuous over time, even if there are significant gaps where you're not playing, like weeks, months. So these practices and activities are sustained over time. There's a sense in which they're kind of unbounded or infinite. You could conceivably just do them forever. Think about these 5 characteristics: internal goods, standards of excellence, requiring self-cultivation, shared with others, and sustained over time. Once we see that happiness consists of activities with these kinds of characteristics, then we can see why the virtues are necessary to live well. So let's start by thinking of the virtue of temperance. Why do I need temperance to live well? Well, temperance, in the strict sense, is the virtue that governs the bodily pleasures of eating and, let's call it, reproduction. I say in the strict sense because there's a strict sense that Aristotle insists is the focal point of the virtue, bodily pleasure. But there's an extended sense where temperance can be applied to pleasure more generally. Let's begin with the strict sense. So in the strict sense of temperance, temperance concerns the pleasures of the body, specifically of touch, involved in eating and reproduction. That is, activities that yield life. Eating yields life in the body of the one eating, and reproduction brings life to the community. Now, the idea behind temperance is that, and let's just go with the bodily pleasures of eating for now. The idea is that eating is an activity that is for your own good, but there's a right way to do it. There's a right amount of food. Not only is there a right food to eat, there's a right time to eat it. And so that is, your eating and your pursuit of this bodily pleasure, while it is good, it's only good within a certain kind of order. Temperance is the virtue that helps you eat in alignment with that order. And I'd say where a lot of people get confused about temperance is that they think temperance is about self-control, like a form of self-restraint. And that's close, kind of, but it's actually not right. Aristotle's very explicit. Temperance is not self-control. And here's why. Self-control only applies when there is an internal conflict in the soul. Okay? You only need self-control when the appetitive part of you is really desiring food, but your better judgment says now's not the right time. That's a conflict. And in a conflict like that, you're going to need self-control for the rational part to overcome the appetite. That's great. That Aristotle doesn't think that's temperance. Temperance is when your appetite and better judgment are aligned. Think of it as frictionless alignment between reason and appetite. That's the virtue of temperance. So the temperate man wants to eat the right amount of food at the right time. So I think it's pretty easy to understand what temperance is with respect to governing bodily pleasure, but we can extend this to pleasure more generally. But before we do that, I do just kind of want to remark that temperance over bodily pleasures is in fact foundational. It is an absolutely foundational virtue. And so plenty of people today, people who do ethics, they're going to kind of roll their eyes at temperance, dismiss it as monkish or Victorian or prudish. Like I said, view it as making a vice out of moral purity. No, 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 people. Temperance is foundational. So you got these people in ethics, they're going to say, no, forget about all these personal virtues, okay? We need to focus on morally serious matters like justice, climate justice, whatever the justice thing is, the big issues, social justice or whatever. Okay, here's the thing. If you can't master your own body, if you can't master your own appetite, you're never going to get to real justice in any authentic way. Justice starts with governing your own appetite. Appetite is a powerful, powerful source of motivation. It dominates babies and small children, and mastering it is the beginning of moral development. So here's the thing. Look at little kids, okay? Look at little kids. If your kid or you see a kid and they can't control what they eat, they just gorge themselves. Well, what's happening, right? Who's running the show, psychologically speaking? Or maybe they can only eat sweets. They can't eat healthy food. They throw temper tantrums if they can't eat sweets. Well, what is that other than being dominated by appetite? Or you see kids, they can't stay on their own plates. They're always eating off of other people's plates, taking food from other people. Okay? Well, something's very wrong. If they can't govern their eating behavior in a way that respects other people, then what chance do they have when they become adults? If you're eating off of other people's plates, I don't mean little kids, I mean like 8 or 9. If you're like grasping for other people's food, then as an adult, what's going to happen when you pursue all these other goods like wealth and status, right? What are you going to do? Well, you're going to continue to eat off of other people's plates, so to speak. You're going to step on other people's toes. You're going to take what's not yours, and that's injustice. Similarly, if you can't restrain yourself from sweets, how are you going to restrain yourself from other kinds of pleasures? Okay? No. So no. Learning to govern the appetite, acquiring the virtue of temperance, that is foundational for moral development. It is the first chance as a small child that you get to learn justice. That's governing what you eat with respect to what is proper to other people. And it's not easy. Hunger and appetite are powerful. So it is an accomplishment, one I think probably all of us achieved by like age 5 or 6. But you're never going to achieve justice if you can't achieve some approximation of temperance. But now let's expand it to temperance and pleasure more generally. Remember, Aristotle thinks happiness consists of these projects sustained over time. Projects that require self-cultivation. Projects that you share with other people, involving commitments to other people. Think about that. And here's the thing. Any real meaningful project or practice is going to unfold over a significant period of time. And you're going to have to stick with it. Sustaining that activity is itself part of the activity. And that's not always easy because you know what? There's always going to be times when there is something more immediately pleasurable that you could be doing. Let's just take the example of sports. If you're going to be good at any athletic endeavor, there's training. And over time, training is not always fun. There will always be more fun things you can do. There's video games. There's all kinds of things you can be doing that are more immediately pleasurable than training or practicing. But if you're going to stay with it and continue your practice, whether it's sports or music, you're going to have to make decisions over and over again to choose that long-term activity, to continually re-engage with that long-term project. You're going to have to choose that over immediate fun and pleasure. And that's why temperance matters for happiness, because you can't pursue the kinds of activities that make up a good life if you can't say no to immediate pleasures. And again, I'm not talking simply about self-control. You're going to need self-control too. The way you're going to develop actual temperance is through exercise of self-control early on. You're going to have to say no to some immediate pleasures if you're ever going to become temperate. But here's the thing. What we're looking for is that frictionless alignment between what you enjoy and what is actually good. Frictionless alignment between the rational part of your soul and the part that desires pleasure. So the temperate person, the temperate man, he enjoys his activities, okay? Because his pleasure aligns with his judgment of what's truly good. So when he's engaging in his practice, it has his full attention. He's not wanting to be somewhere else. He's not distracted. He's fully absorbed in what he's doing. And when those opportunities come up, those prospects for pleasure, for the more immediate pleasures, where he could deviate from his project, deviate from his practice, he's just not really that tempted. It's not that he can't appreciate the immediate pleasures. He can. And there's even a place in the good life for them. But the volume on those, it's kind of turned down because he finds so much pleasure in the good activities he's committed to. So he's not really that tempted. And that means he doesn't need self-control all the time to stick to the good activities because he enjoys the good activities. I mean, what else would he rather be doing? So to close it off with an example, think of someone like Mozart, a great composer and musician. Mozart is fully absorbed in his work. And despite what you saw in that movie, he's not easily distracted or pulled away from his work because he has a proper appreciation and enjoyment of the goodness of his activity. So even though he can appreciate the immediate pleasures, he's not pained by saying no to them because he understands and he has the proper enjoyment of what he's doing. And that's what it means to have temperance, to have a proper rational appreciation and proper enjoyment of the good activities that make for a good life. And that way you're able to sustain these activities over time and you're not just pulled away from them all the time by any prospect for immediate pleasure. And remember, it's not self-control. It's not like fighting a war within yourself. Like that's important, okay? And that's part of the path to virtue. But virtue is achieving that alignment between appetite for pleasure and alignment of that to your reason, such that it doesn't pain you to turn down those opportunities. So the temperate man feels greater pleasures at the greater activity. That's why he's not pulled away by all these prospects. And there's always going to be, like if you live life, no matter what project or path you take, no matter what your commitments, there's always going to be prospects for pleasure that could pull you off. The temperate man is able to sustain these good activities over time because he's not constantly being tempted by these inferior pleasures. That's the virtue of temperance. So moving on to courage. Why is courage necessary for living well? Well, again, just like we saw with temperance, there's going to be a strict sense of courage and an extended sense. The strict sense is courage in battle. Think of this as the limit of courage. Courage is most fully exemplified in battle because there you're taking this incredible risk of fighting other humans, trained, resourceful just like you, and you're doing it for the love of your own country. So that's the limit. And that's the most extreme case. But outside of that strict sense, courage is very important for living the good life in general. Now, before getting into the general sense of courage, let's warm up with the paradigm case, courage in battle. So what is courage? And I ask because it's something people tend to get wrong. The common misconception of courage a lot of people have is that they think courage is not feeling any fear. Well, courage, according to Aristotle, is not the absence of fear at all. Aristotle thinks courage contains fear. And I realize this is counterintuitive. So quick time out. Let's briefly remind ourselves how Aristotle thinks virtues work. Aristotle thinks virtues are states of desire and emotion that align with reason. Sometimes the way we say this is that virtues are states that bring the non-rational part of the soul into agreement with the rational. The non-rational part of your soul is where feelings come from, desires and emotions. Now back to courage. Courage is interesting because it involves two aspects of your non-rational soul, two feelings. It involves fear and it involves confidence. Courage is the proper balance of these two motivations. And that might sound counterintuitive because you might have thought confidence was completely good and fear completely bad. So first, what does Aristotle mean by confidence? Well, Aristotle uses a Greek word, thumos, and I'm translating it as confidence. It's a feeling. Think of this as that tangible feeling of confidence you have like when you're playing chess and you're completely in the zone and you can feel that you can't lose. Or that feeling just as you walk out on stage. You've mastered a piece of music and you're about to absolutely smash it in a performance. Or if you lift, that feeling when you just cranked out a heavy set and it felt light. And you know you can crank out another. It feels like there's just electricity, coming out of your hands, like Thor. Well, that's thumos, and it energizes you to pursue your goals, to overcome your opponent and any obstacle in your way. No question it's good, right? Well, to a certain extent, right? Need I remind you of Leroy Jenkins, okay? Too much confidence can make you blind to danger and you can get yourself killed, virtually or even in real life. So the implication of Aristotle's view is that fear is good, or better, a little fear, or the right amount of fear is good. Fear keeps you out of trouble. Fear heightens your senses, makes you more alert and more aware of dangers. If all you have is confidence without any fear, then you're going to pull a Leroy Jenkins. So it's not enough to have confidence. You also need that contribution of fear too, so that you pursue your objective, but you do so in a careful way. Now, obviously, if you have too much fear, the problem is that you'll withdraw from battle. You're not going to go in and take the initiative. You're not going to make anything happen. You're not going to take the fight to the enemy. So you need that correct balance of confidence and fear so that the fear doesn't hold you back. Confidence moves you towards the objective, but fear makes you do it in a careful and alert way. So the take-home lesson, it's a balance. And again, it's not self-control. Everything we talked about with temperance is going to apply here. Yes, there's a certain morally admirable self-control where someone is afraid and must overcome the fear. You'll get no argument from me that that's not praiseworthy. It is. That's just not what Aristotle's talking about with the virtue of courage. Aristotle identifies the virtue of courage as that balance. You have the confidence to go in there and confront the enemy, but you also have just enough fear so that you don't do it in a foolhardy manner. So that's the strict sense, or the complete sense of courage. Nowhere is courage more exemplified than on the battlefield. But there's also an extended sense in which courage is needed just for life. Think back to what we said about extended projects and practices and commitments as being the substance of happiness. The good life is made up of these activities over time. And here's the thing about any complex activity sustained over time that is worthwhile. You're going to incur risk. I promise you. And you're going to incur unexpected risk. You won't always see it coming. And when it comes, you might be tempted to deviate from your course. You might be tempted to give up. You might be tempted to abandon your project or commitment to someone. Well, if you're going to flourish and you're going to follow through, you have to have the right amount of confidence. If you're just walking around anxious and fearful all the time, you'll always be blown off course when something unexpected happens. So you don't want to be a fearful person. You're not going to succeed in life. You want to be a confident person, and that's the extended sense of courage. And specifically, even in everyday life, if you're doing anything worthwhile, if you have a particular commitment to real particular people, if you have projects that you pursue that are actually meaningful, I promise you're going to come into conflict with other people. For example, you're going to have enemies. So some people are bad. There's always going to be some bad people. So that's one way you can have enemies. But I'm telling you, if you do anything worthwhile, you're going to have conflict with other people. And so confrontation and having the confidence to go through with confrontation is part of the good life. You have to do it. As kind of an aside, some people get a little bit confused by Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies. And they confuse loving your enemies, that it's good to love your enemies, with it being good to never have any in the first place. Well, that's not what Jesus says there. Jesus says it's good to love your enemies. Okay, so it's good to reconcile with your enemies. It's good to bless your enemies. And it is. I hope you reconcile with your enemies. But if you're really living life in any meaningful sense, If you stand for anything worthwhile, you're going to have enemies and you're going to have to confront them. So if you're trying to follow Jesus, remember that Jesus had a lot of enemies. Well, why did Jesus have enemies? Because Jesus did worthwhile things. Jesus made substantive commitments, and he didn't shrink from confrontation. We're now ready to talk about justice. Now, this would be the easiest to justify if we were talking about morality or the modern conception of morality. But remember, we're talking about eudaimonia, the best kind of life, the flourishing life. So, really, the question is, why is it good for me to have the virtue of justice? And there's an idea that a lot of people have intuitively that justice is onerous, that it's a kind of burden. Justice kind of sucks and it's painful. And we do it because ultimately it brings about external things like wealth and reputation that we value, but justice itself we could do without. And this is essentially Glaucon's challenge to Socrates in Plato's Republic. In Book 2, Glaucon is like, well, why don't you praise justice for itself, not just for the external goods it brings about, like wealth and honor? And I'll give you a little bit of the explanation here. So what we want to understand is, why is it good for me to have justice? Okay, to have the virtue of justice. And so we have to go back to eudaimonia. We have to go back to the idea that the good life consists of activities, projects, commitments, complex activities with standards of excellence sustained over time, right? The good life is the active life. Now we have to recognize that the active life is, in fact, the social life. These perfective activities making up the good life are activities shared with other people, and they require us to coordinate with other people. So the good life is the social life. Now, if you doubt me, it might be helpful to think of the movie Castaway, where Tom Hanks is on that island all by himself. Now, think about all your projects and think about your goals. Think about the things that you're looking forward to this week. Think about the things that you're looking to achieve next year and the things that you want to achieve over the course of your life. Well, how many of those goals and how many of those projects would survive if you were on that island all by yourself? I think if you made a list, and seriously, you can pause the video and make one right now. But if you sat down and you made a list of what you're looking forward to today, this week, the next 6 months, the next year, the next 10 years, if you actually made a list of all the things that you're excited about, all the things you're hoping for, all the things you're looking forward to, you'd find that none of it makes any sense apart from the social world. None of it makes any sense alone on that island. Well, the social life is ordered, and justice establishes and maintains that order. Okay, so the good life's not just active, it's social, and it's coordinated with other people. That means there is an order which governs the coordination. Well, what determines the right order? Oh yeah, we're coordinating in activities aimed at excellence. Therefore, a right order governs the coordinated activity towards the ultimate aims of the activity. And thus, a right order is aimed at the excellence particular to the coordinated activity. Justice is the right order of coordinated activity in life. And so the virtue of justice is a person's ability to navigate that right order in common endeavors as part of a social group. Now, coordinated activity with other people has cooperative elements and it also has competitive elements. And both cooperation and competition are going to fall under justice. When we start thinking about all those excellent activities, those shared activities, well, usually those activities are going to take place in the context of some kind of group. So let's go back to high school, since that's probably the common background of everyone watching. So I don't know you. I don't know what all you've done, and I don't want to know. But you probably went to high school. And if you went to high school, you were probably pushed into music or athletics. Some of us were pushed into both. And playing in an ensemble or playing on a team is actually really good preparation for the good life because the good life is exactly like this. There's a group, and the group is cooperatively striving for some kind of excellence. And there's a competitive element to the group's activity, right? You're probably competing with other groups. And so everyone in the group, everyone on the team, everyone in the ensemble, everyone's got to come together and everyone has a contribution to make. Members have different roles and different contributions, and the group really needs everyone to contribute excellently if the group as a whole is to achieve excellence. And so the idea here is that whatever your individual talent, whatever individual goods you can achieve on your own, there's more available, more of these internal goods, right? There's more available as a member of a cooperative group. So think of yourself as an individual athlete or a musician. Your activity is improved and extended and perfected by being woven into joint activities with others. So it's more excellent to be a great athlete on a team of great athletes. It's greater to be a great musician in a great ensemble than just alone. That's Aristotle's idea. So the way Aristotle understands human excellence, for you to manifest your human potential, for you to fully participate and be most active, is for you to be part of a larger group where the contributions to the activities of the various individuals are woven together into the activity of a group to achieve a good that transcends that attainable alone by any particular member. And that's the good life, participating in something like that. All right, so this is going to bring us to distributive justice. So why do we need justice? Well, let's just sit and think back about how these groups operate. So first, people are going to have different roles, and these roles are going to have different degrees of prominence. So as an example, I love tuba players. I love trombone players. My son plays trombone. But who's going to carry the melody? Let's be honest. Trumpet players, right? They're more likely to carry the melody. French horns, like we get the melody sometimes. So look, everyone's got a role, but some roles are more prominent than others. And even within that division, there's first chair trumpet, right? There's the second chair trumpet part. There might even be a third chair trumpet part. Shifting to sports, different positions make different contributions to the team, and we treat them differently, right? O-linemen are absolutely essential to the team. If you want to win, you have to have smart and athletic O-linemen, but it's not the most prominent position. The quarterback is much more often in a position to make or break the game or to make or break the play. So even though O-linemen are absolutely essential and their excellence is critical, the contribution of the quarterback is much more prominent. Then think about backups. Like, look, there are starters and there are backups, and the backups matter, right? They're important. They have a role. They're not going to get as much fame and as much honor as the starters, though. And here's the thing. Anytime you have a group that is aimed at excellent activity and it has different complex roles that require different talents and different contributions, that group needs to distribute those roles and those positions in a way that contributes to the excellence of the whole. And that means the roles have to be distributed according to demonstrated performance, evaluated according to the standards of excellence internal to the activity. In other words, by merit. That's why we have tryouts. We're trying to discern where the excellence is, because we want to give the first chair trumpet to the best trumpet player. We want to give the starting wideout role to the best receiver. So distributive justice is giving positions, roles, and the associated benefits, honor and wealth to the people to the degree that they can contribute to the excellence of the group. And that's distributive justice. So a major part of what it means for you to have the virtue of justice is that you can navigate that social order and you can participate in giving to each member of the group the positions and honors that they deserve. It means that you play an active role in sustaining this order that evaluates according to excellence and assigns accordingly. That's distributive justice, and it is central to the cooperative aspect of shared endeavors. And this leads us to rules of fair play. Now, even though teams ultimately cooperate together, that doesn't mean that there are no elements of competition within them. If you want to understand human social life, understand human social life has cooperative and competitive elements. They go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And this is really important, okay? This is important. So the way a lot of people get ethics and morality wrong today is, hey, they like the cooperative side. And the cooperative side is good. It's essential, and you have to have it. But there will also always be the competitive side too. and it's every bit as essential to the whole. So we have to account for competition. And that means we have rules of fair play governing our contest. These rules have to ultimately be aimed at facilitating excellence in the contest, right? And I have to tell you, the Greeks loved contest. They thought of life as composed of series of contests. And I think they were onto something. So in contest, we want the outcome of the competition to be determined by the particular excellences that are particular to the activity, right? You want the rules set up so that the best boxer usually wins the bout, so that the best football team usually wins the game. The contest is supposed to facilitate, manifest, and reveal excellence. And fair rules are essential to this. So think about music. We want the player with the most musical excellence to get the first part. So typically you're going to have blind auditions. You sit behind a screen. Beforehand, everyone's told what scales to have memorized, what piece of music that you need to perform. So that way everyone's got a chance to practice. And when the actual auditions happen, it happens behind a screen. And that way there's no favoritism. We're just evaluating musical excellence. So when the team has tryouts or when the ensemble has tryouts, everyone plays according to the same rules, the rules of fair play. Part of the virtue of justice is being able to compete, being able to go and strive for excellence, strive to outdo your rival, strive to outdo your opponent or even your teammate, but to do it according to the rules of fair play, because that's what facilitates excellence for the whole. And here's the thing. The most excellent activity, the most excellent contribution, the most active you can be is part of a successful group, an excellent group. So if you're not playing by the rules of fair play, you're really compromising the group. And if they fail to achieve excellence, so do you. Relatedly, when you're part of any group, when you're part of a team, heck, when you get married, people are taking a risk by affiliating with you. They aligned with you, not someone else. Okay? You're the one on the team, not someone else. You're the spouse, not someone else. Like they could have chosen someone else, but they chose you. And you don't want people to suffer because they chose to associate with you. You don't want to punish them for that choice. And that means you have to carry your fair share of the load and not take more than your fair share of the benefits. So when we have these groups and these teams aimed at excellence, there are often all kinds of benefits that come with that. External benefits. Wealth and honor are the two most common. Excellence attracts wealth and honor. And you don't want to be the person who essentially punishes people for affiliating with you because you take more than your fair share of those goods. You might get away with that once or twice, but it's really short-sighted because you're actually setting your sights on the inferior goods and not the higher goods of excellence, those internal goods we're talking about. That's what unjust people do. They fix their attention on the secondary goods, like the status and the wealth, right? The lotions and the creams. And they compromise the achievement of the more excellent goods. Probably the greatest illustration of this that you've probably seen is Gollum in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien is actually giving a pretty direct response to Glaucon's challenge. Remember, Glaucon's challenge to Socrates is that anyone with a ring of invisibility would prefer to do injustice rather than justice, showing that we only value justice for those external benefits like wealth and reputation. Well, Gollum's got a ring of invisibility. He's got it for a long time, and he uses it for injustice. However, we can see very clearly Gollum is missing out on all the goods of living a life among other people. He's completely miserable, and that's because he sought inferior goods over the superior goods of a just and convivial life. Now, ultimately, this will bring us to an aspect of justice. Sometimes it's treated as a separate virtue called loyalty or fidelity. When you affiliate with particular people and groups, that's the group or that's the person with whom you're embarking on these pursuits. So you're committed to them and you owe them fidelity. More specifically, in order to freely pursue the good, freely pursue these activities, a lot of what we do together is by agreement. It's not coerced. Making deals, making partnerships, areas where the two members of the group or the members of the partnership are vulnerable with respect to one another. These are free associations where people rely on each other pulling their own weight. And what that means is you got to be a man of your word. So in these free associations and partnerships, there's always an element of vulnerability that we cover, that we protect by commitment. So you shouldn't make promises in vain. If you make a promise, you need to do everything you can to keep it. If you just habitually cannot do that, you just cannot follow through on anything. If you're not the kind of being that Nietzsche says can be responsible for the future, then you can't flourish in partnerships and free associations. And frankly, people won't associate with you. Once they realize by reputation that you can't be relied upon, that you're not faithful, you're not loyal, you don't follow through, they're going to freeze you out. People aren't going to join with you, and you're going to miss out. And you're not going to live a successful life without faithfulness. So, if we're putting it all together, the good life involves successful activities and groups. It requires distributive justice. It requires competition according to fair play. So, you can't be someone who's always trying to take more than your fair share. And at the end of the day, the structure of social life is such that so much of it is somewhat indeterminate. And it's open for us to make free associations or freely chosen partnerships to kind of fill it in. And those only work if you can keep your word, if you have the virtue of fidelity, an aspect of justice. So, anyway, to sum up, there is no flourishing life apart from having the virtue of justice. Finally, there's practical wisdom. Why do we need that virtue to live well? Well, so far we've seen that the various projects, activities, and commitments of a good life are all responses to all kinds of different goods. You have all sorts of different opportunities to pursue different kinds of goods, some superior and some inferior. Well, the problem is that we don't always recognize which are the best goods. Remember the problem with the unjust or grasping man. He's unjust because he seeks material wealth outside his fair share. But he's actually hurting himself because he's missing out on all the higher goods of excellent activity within the group. So we can be misled and we can chase inferior goods and lose the higher ones. So remember Gollum. He chases the lesser goods at the expense of the greater. Well, how then do you structure your pursuit of the goods to get the best? One way you could organize your pursuit of various goods would be to itemize them all according to a common metric. And so, it would be really nice if all the various good things in the world, all the good activities you could do, if they could all be compared along a single continuum by a single metric of value. That's what the utilitarians thought. They thought they could break down every act worth doing in terms of a quantifiable amount of pleasure it would yield. Well, here's the major problem with that utilitarian view. The various pleasures of life are qualitatively incommensurable. The pleasure of winning at tennis is just a very different kind of pleasure compared to the pleasure of having dinner with your family. They're just two different kinds of things, and you can't directly compare them in terms of some one common quantifiable element. So ultimately, what you realize, if you think about this long enough, it's not so much that family dinner yields pleasure as some external benefit. You just kind of get some of that pleasure. And then winning at tennis also yields the very same pleasure. And you just kind of get some of that. That's not how pleasure works at all. The pleasure is in the activity itself, right? When you're playing tennis and you're winning, your focus is not on, am I getting enough pleasure? Right? Like as an external benefit. No. If you're thinking about that, you're not playing tennis and you're not enjoying it. Okay. The pleasures and enjoyment, right, of tennis, it's in the tennis game itself. Just like in a really pleasant dinner, your attention is not on the pleasure. Well, your attention is on the food and the people and the conversation. Okay. And so what that means is if we're talking about the various goods of life, we're not going to be able to compare them according to a single quantifiable criterion of pleasure. So the utilitarians were wrong. And the way we organize our life is not according to some principle of maximizing a single good, because the good in life involves all kinds of incommensurable goods. So if the goods of life are incommensurable, you might wonder, how can there be greater or lesser goods? Didn't you just tell me that they were inferior and superior? How can we rationally pursue goods without a common metric, right? Just think about it. If the good life is pursuing the superior goods and not being distracted by the inferior goods, we need to know how to tell which is which, right? How do we compare them? We just said the utilitarians are wrong. There's not some common currency like pleasure. So, how then do we rationally order our pursuit of these goods? Well, here's the thing. Sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so, if you have a vision of life as a whole, you can start to see the contribution the various goods make to it as a whole. Even though you can't necessarily pull the two goods apart and compare them side by side, you can hold them up to a vision of the good life as a whole. And so I'm describing what is called holism about the value of activities. So what is that vision of the good life as a whole? Well, that's what you need practical wisdom to grasp, that vision of the good life as a whole. And then if you have that virtue, then you can understand how various projects and commitments shape and compose the best life. Understanding how to live a good life, it's not a science, it's not math, it's not calculating units of pleasure. Living the good life is an art. It's weaving together different good commitments towards various projects, people, and pursuits into a life as a whole. So practical wisdom isn't simply calculating opportunities for pleasure and tallying up the highest expected utility. You have to have a vision, a real vision of a good life as a whole. And within this vision, you can see how projects and commitments to particular people shape it. From there, you have to weave together all these activities, all these practices, all these commitments into a coherent life as a whole. And to do that, you have to have the virtue of practical wisdom. So, in conclusion, we've just seen why you need the four cardinal virtues to live well. And if you've already forgotten, remember they're temperance, courage, justice, and practical wisdom. What we've seen is the good life is the active life. It consists of a series of activities, practices, projects, and particular commitments to particular people, shared with others, sustained over time, according to standards of excellence. We've seen that practical wisdom brings it all together and gives you the vision to order your pursuit of goods. Because of the significant social dimension of the good life, you need the virtue of justice to fully inhabit the activities and associations of eudaimonia. And you're only going to be just if you can compete in the contest of life by the rules of fair play. You're only just if, within your associations and partnerships, you consistently give people what they deserve, and if you remain faithful to the people you're committed to along the way. Thus, you need integrity. To wrap it up, we can connect then the virtues of temperance and courage to integrity. Okay, so any path involving projects and commitments sustained over time is going to be beset by temptations to abandon it for something else easier or more fun in the moment. If you're trying to remain faithful to particular people, if you're trying to remain committed to a project, if you're trying to sustain a practice, you're always going to have moments where you're going to have to say yes to risk. Similarly, these moments are always going to arise when you're going to have to say no to something that's more immediately pleasurable or fun. Thus, living a complete life as a whole, woven together from many practices and commitments over time, has to be sustained in the face of temptations. And here I want to emphasize that the temptations to deviate take two broad forms based on the kind of desire and emotion that structures the temptation. Either temptation can take the form of being led away by positive emotion as an opportunity for pleasure, or temptation can kind of push you off track with a negative emotion like fear or discomfort. Here's the thing. On any long journey, there are always going to be times where desire reveals something more immediately pleasurable, exciting, or a more lucrative opportunity than staying on your path. And if you always go in for that, if you're always led away by desire for what's more promising in the moment, then you're never going to be able to sustain any commitment to any practice, to any person, or to any path. And the same applies to negative emotion. No matter what road you travel, risk and confrontations will emerge, and fear will tempt you to pull away from your commitments, to turn back, maybe find an easier path. If you can't overcome these two kinds of temptations, then you're going to be unreliable and you won't have any integrity. And you're really going to miss out on, as your life's going to contain no long-term projects and commitments, nothing meaningful. You have to have temperance and courage. If Aristotle is right, living a life as a whole is an achievement. It's not by default, it's not guaranteed. You could just bounce around from one desire to the next, or away from one fear and then another. And if you're just tossed back and forth by positive and negative affect, then you're living a completely reactive life. Aristotle wants you to live a rational and active life, meaning one where you're exercising your agency to pursue the goods that you can rationally perceive. So, in conclusion, the virtues are absolutely as relevant today as they ever were. You cannot live a good life without these four virtues. You absolutely must achieve at least an approximation of them to have any coherent life. Now, the discussion today introduces only one dimension of the virtues. There's a lot more to learn, a lot more to discover, and a lot more to talk about. So if you're interested in learning more, hit subscribe.